Hey everyone, I'm Priya Rajgopal from the product management team here at Couchbase, and today I'm going to be talking about Capella App Services. I'm going to give a walkthrough of how you can enable secure offline first data sync capabilities using our fully managed application backend. So what is Capella App Services? It is a fully managed application backend that brings the power of Couchbase Mobile to Capella. If you're not familiar with Couchbase Mobile, it's the industry-leading offline-first data sync platform for mobile, desktop, and embedded applications. And since its launch back in 2014, Couchbase Mobile has powered a vast number of business-critical applications. So Capella is the Couchbase's as-a-service cloud offering. It includes Couchbase Server, which is a fully managed database as-a-service solution. And now we have App Services, which is our fully managed application backend. In this walkthrough, we are going to be focusing on Capella App Services. If you're not familiar with Capella or Couchbase Server offering on Capella, please check out the resources listed below. The proof is in the pudding. Let's get started with the walkthrough. So what we are going to do is migrate an existing Couchbase mobile application to use Capella App Services. So if you'd like to follow along with this walkthrough, go ahead and clone this repo. So this particular application that we're going to be using is available on our developer portal. So let's head over to our developer portal. So go to developer.couchbase.com/learn, and we are going to use the Swift application for iOS. Go to the Data Sync Fundamentals menu. And what we'll be doing is essentially following through the first set of steps until we get to the backend installation. So this particular tutorial was developed for on-prem deployment of Couchbase Mobile. What we're going to be doing is replacing the backend installation with Capella App Services. So once you have cloned the repo, head over to the source folder in the repo. And as a first step, you're going to install the Couchbase Swift SDK, and then you're going to link it to the iOS application. So you're going to give the version that has to be deployed at the time of this recording. This is the latest version of Couchbase Lite. So I'm going to go ahead and download Couchbase Lite. This can take a few minutes to download, so let's be patient here. Looks like the Couchbase LiteSwift framework has been downloaded. The next step is let's open up the Xcode project. And let's bring in that framework, the Couchbase Lite framework that you just downloaded. So it's a download framework. And click on this, drag, drop, don't copy, and finish this. And let's just build and run the application in the simulator. Okay, so if everything goes according to plan, you should see this login screen here. Okay, so now that you have the Couchbase Lite iOS application locally running on your laptop, the next step is to set up Capella App Services. If you look at the instructions here, so we have essentially come to this point in the tutorial, and we are now going to do the backend installation. But we're going to now skip through the rest of this tutorial because this relates to an on-prem deployment. Instead, we are going to head over to Capella App Services. So here's the user journey. So as part of the walkthrough, we are essentially going to go through all these steps in order. So the first step is to address the prerequisite, which is setting up a Couchbase server cluster. So you have to deploy it on Capella. If you have never used Capella, you can go and sign up for our 30-day free trial. For that, just head over to couchbase.com and you can sign up for our 30-day free trial. And I've logged in to my trial account. Once you log into the trial account, you should see a screen similar to this getting started screen. And you can deploy the trial cluster on AWS and GCP. Azure is coming soon. So the first thing you do is go ahead and deploy the cluster. This trial cluster, it takes a few minutes to deploy. So we'll circle back in a bit. Okay, so now our trial cluster is ready. Let's quickly go into the trial cluster. You see that it's set up with a sample travel sample bucket. But for our sample application, we are going to create a new bucket. Just give it any name. Leave the rest of the stuff to defaults. So there's no documents in the bucket. We are not going to spend much time exploring the trial cluster. If you're interested, be sure to check out the links in the resources section below. So we have essentially deployed a Couchbase server cluster and set it up with a bucket, a demo bucket. It comes with a travel sample bucket. And the next step is to launch our app services and connect it to the Couchbase server cluster. So for that, again, head over to the Capella trial UI. You can either go to the App Services tab, Create App Service. You're going to go to the Getting Started page, click on Try App Services now. It's going to take, again, a few minutes to deploy and launch the app services. We'll get back to this in a few minutes. Okay, so the app service is now ready. Let's explore it a bit. The app service is deployed. It is linked to the trial cluster. We are doing this demonstration in the context of a free trial tenant. Once you upgrade to a paid offering, you will have the option of actually configuring the size of the app service that's being deployed. So anyway, let's jump into the app service. You see that there are multiple configuration options available here. Go to the configuration. As I mentioned, since this is a free trial cluster, you do not have the choice of changing the deployment configuration. But in a paid cluster, you can choose the number of nodes and the compute associated with the cluster. So this will allow you to scale your cluster horizontally and vertically. There are other options as far as monitoring and specifying the allow IP list. We'll take a look at that as we proceed through the demonstration. At the conclusion of the previous part of the demonstration, we have essentially deployed an app services cluster. The cluster of Sync Gateway nodes that's deployed is fronted by a load balancer, the app services cluster, and is connected to the backend Couchbase server cluster. So moving along in the user journey, now that we have our Couchbase server cluster, we have launched app services. The next thing you would do is create one or more app endpoints on the app service. So what is an app endpoint? An app endpoint, think of it as a representation of your application on your app service. So this is the endpoint to which your mobile, desktop, Couchbase Lite powered applications will connect to. So let's head back into Capella UI and begin by configuring one or more app endpoints. So I'm going to start. I have to start by giving the app endpoint a name. So for this sample application that we are going to be using, give it the name user profile. And that is because our iOS application internally expects this to be the remote database URL endpoint that it connects to. So make sure that you choose the name user profile, select a bucket. We are now going to use the travel sample bucket, but if you were going to create a second app endpoint and you had a travel sample application, you can select the travel sample bucket. So now select the demo. By default, all connections from the client are authenticated using basic auth. And you have an option of changing this after setting up your app endpoint. Data sync by default is disabled. You have the option of also setting import filters. For this demonstration, we are going to leave it as default, which means all the documents in the backing bucket are automatically imported by the app service. So let's go ahead and create the app endpoint. So when the app endpoint is created, notice that it is set up in offline mode. go ahead and set up the security configuration associated with the app endpoint. So the first thing you want to do is set up the access control policies, which determines which users have access to what subset of documents. Now, the access control policies are defined as a JavaScript function. The JavaScript function that we're going to be using is going to be borrowed from our existing sample application. So go to the repo that you cloned. And notice that there's a bunch of JSON files. So if you were doing an on-prem deployment, you would be setting up all this configuration through this JSON file. The JSON file also includes, at least in earlier versions of Sync Gateway, includes the access control sync function. Of course, there is a way to also do this programmatically through the admin endpoint in on-prem deployments. But in this particular sample application, it is the legacy mode. So we're using the sync function, which is embedded within this JSON file. So let's open this JSON file. And what we're going to do is copy this sync function, which corresponds to the access control function, and set that up on our app endpoint. So let's go ahead and copy this, scroll all the way. Not too much. Copy this, head back to our Capella UI and paste this. Okay. For convenience, I'll also include a link to a GitHub gist that will include just this access control function that is used in the demonstration. So let's go ahead and save this. Now we've got our access control function set up. Briefly explore the access control function. The first thing to notice is that every document is associated with a channel. The channel ID is constructed using the username extracted from the document, and it's prefixed with a channel.prefix. Then in addition to routing the document to a specific channel, we are also giving a user access to a specific channel. This is through the Access API. If you're not familiar with the basics of how access control works using channels, check out the links that is included in the resources section for more information. For the purposes of this demo, it just suffices to know that documents are tagged with a particular ID and users are given access to particular channels. And by having access to a particular channel, they have access to the documents in that channel. The next step is setting up the authentication provider. The authentication provider specifies how the application users are authenticated. By default, it's basic auth. You have an option of setting up an OIDC provider and registering that with the app service, or you can also enable anonymous authentication. As the name indicates, there is no credentials that need to be provided for accessing the data. However, this is only for read-only access, and this is useful really if some application is using public static data. Okay, so for our sample application, we're going to be using basic auth for authenticating the client with the app service. So we'll leave it as the default. I'm going to go ahead and resume the app endpoint. So once I resume the app endpoint, I should be able to start connecting my application to the app endpoint. The app endpoint is online. We have set up the access control policy. We have set up the authentication provider. Now we have to create one or more users who have access to this app endpoint. So for that, head over to the App Users tab. And for the demo, I'm going to create a user, demo@example.com, give it a password that you remember. Again, these are credentials that you will use when logging into the iOS sample application. Leave the status as enabled. You have an option of specifying one or more channels that this particular user has access to. By default, users have access to the public channel that hosts the public documents. I'm going to skip this configuration because if you recall, when I showed the access control JavaScript function, I'm dynamically using the access API to assign users access to the channel. There's also an option of specifying the app roles. This is again optional. Think of app roles as a logical grouping of users. In my application that we are using for this walkthrough, there are no app roles, but you can create an app role and you can assign a user to a role. As I mentioned, you could also create an app role, assign the role to a channel. You can do it statically, or you can also do it through the access control function using the same access API that I showed earlier. So at this point, I've got my user set up. I've got the access control function configured. I've got the authentication provider set as basic auth. Take a look at this configuration at any point. You can change the configuration option. So now let's switch back to slides. So essentially, we created an app endpoint and we went ahead and configured the app endpoint. You can have as many app endpoints as there are buckets in the backing Couchbase server. So the next step in the process is to connect your application. So again, a quick look at where we are in terms of the deployment. We have your app service and we have set up the app endpoint. So the next step is to connect applications to the app endpoint. And for this, we are going to use the Couchbase Lite iOS application that we downloaded earlier. And we are going to set it up to connect and sync data with the app endpoint. Let's head back to the UI and go to the Connect tab of the app endpoint. There are a number of options when it comes to connecting applications to the app endpoint. You've got public endpoint, you've got an admin connection endpoint, you've got metrics endpoint. We'll talk about all of these endpoints in a little bit. But first, let's focus on the public connection URL. This is a secure WebSockets URL. This is used for data sync from the Couchbase Lite client. So let's copy this and head over to our sample application. If you've got your Xcode project open, go to the database manager.swift file and look for the remote URL. Just zoom it in a little bit and replace this URL endpoint, the one that comes default, with the connection string that I just copied. So that's it. That's all you have to do as far as changing your application. So let's go ahead and build and run the application. So the credentials with which I'm going to log into the app would be the app user that I created earlier. So heading back to our Capella UI, go to the app users tab. You see the user that was created. You're going to use that credential and log into the application. This is a very simple application. It's got a user profile screen. I'm going to update the fields. When I press done, it's creating a document with a specific ID, and it persists that in the local Couchbase Lite embedded database. Now that document that's locally persisted is synchronized back to the Capella backend, and it is persisted in the backing Couchbase server bucket. So if everything goes well, we should see this document sync back to Capella. So let's check that out. So for this, go to the app service, go to the linked clusters tab, the buckets, we've got the demo bucket, and let's look at the documents in the demo bucket. So I'm going to just look for the document by ID. I happen to know the ID of the document that was created by that iOS application. So it starts with user : and then whatever your username is, you're going to have to specify that. That is how the document ID is constructed. So if your username that you used in your walkthrough with something other than demo@example.com, let's say it's foobar, then your document ID would be user::foobar. So let's go ahead and retrieve the document. So we just see that this document that was created in Couchbase Lite has been synced over to Capella. Let's look at the document. And to be sure that this is the same document that we are syncing, let's bring these things side by side. Let's make some updates. And you have an option of updating the document directly through the Capella UI. But if you're using one of our many Couchbase server SDKs, you can build a backend application using one of our many SDKs, and you can use that for updating the document as well. So let's save this. You can see that that change is instantaneously synced down to Couchbase Lite. And of course, it's, the sync is bidirectional, as we just saw. Now we've demonstrated offline first sync capabilities using Couchbase Lite and Capella App Services. But what about the case where you simply want to read or write the documents directly without the need for data sync? So you don't need local persistence using Couchbase Lite embedded database. And that's possible as well. Let's head over to the app services, go to my trial app service, expand this a little bit, go to the app endpoint and our connection tab. So this particular URL endpoint, that is the WebSockets one, is used for data sync. But we can copy this URL and just replace the WSS scheme with HTTPS. And this will serve as a public REST endpoint that will allow you to read or write access. Of course, every access that comes in through that REST endpoint is subject to the same access control mechanism that we configured earlier. It's also subject to the same authentication and authorization policies that we configured on the app endpoint. What are the REST endpoints that are available? Well, let's get to our docs page. So go to our Capella documentation under app services. You can go to the references section and you've got the public REST endpoint. So these are the set of REST endpoints that are available. So in this particular case, you don't really need a Couchbase Lite application, but of course you can still have an application which has got Couchbase Lite embedded in it for offline first sync, but it can directly access the app services through the public REST endpoint. So to demonstrate that, I'm going to use Postman. You can use any HTTP client of your choice. So I've just set up a collection, also set up an environment file. So the first thing I'm going to do is edit this environment file and set up the public URL, update it to point to the public URL that was displayed from the connect screen, and replace the WSS scheme with HTTPS. So what I'm going to do is actually fetch that document. So this is the public URL, and I'm going to fetch the document. This is the same document ID that I used earlier. And again, I'll zoom this in a little bit. The other thing is, as far as authorization goes, you have to set this up so the username happens to be the username of the app user that I created earlier. Let's go ahead and retrieve the document. You can also create or update the document. So what we're going to do for that is, I'm going to just copy this document, go to the body, replace it. You have to do a little bit of cleanup. This revision ID is something that is auto-generated. You have to provide the revision of the document that you're updating. So I'm going to specify that here and remove this ID and rev parameters. I'm going to actually change this address. So let's go ahead and update this document. Looks like the update went through okay. Let's head over to Capella UI. I'm going to go to my cluster, trial cluster, once again to the documents. I'm going to retrieve the same document. And notice that the address has been updated to show that all of this is live. Let's go to the simulator and you see that the iOS application has also been updated. Okay, so now let's head back to slides. We connected a couple of client applications to the app endpoint. So we had a Postman HTTP-based client that connected to the app endpoint through the public REST endpoint. And then we had Couchbase Lite enabled mobile iOS application that securely synced data. So what's next? It is possible to connect an admin or a metrics, a backend application to the app endpoint. So why is this useful? The admin API allows programmatic control over user administration. So the app users that you created through the Capella UI, you can also create that through the secure admin API. And what about the metrics endpoint? Well, of course, if it's very likely, although Capella UI supports metrics dashboards that provide access to common operational stats in our actual production environment, that you would bring your own monitoring framework like Prometheus. So let's get back to the Capella UI. Head to the Connect tab of the app endpoint. And so this is the admin connection. Once again, if you want to know the list of the REST API that's exposed, so you can go to the references section in our documentation, and you should see the list of the endpoints that are available. So let's get back to the UI. I'm going to copy the admin connection string and go back to my Postman client. And now I'm going to create a user through the admin API. And this is most likely how things are going to be done in a production environment. So let's go to the environment setup for this Postman collection. I'm going to replace the admin URL with the URL from the Connect tab. Set that up. That's good to go. And let's go ahead and first retrieve the user. So well, that seems to be taking an awfully long time, and that's probably because, well, guess what? I have not set up the admin endpoint to accept connections from my laptop. So essentially, while the public endpoint, as the name indicates, the public URL has unrestricted access, of course, subject to authentication and authorization, to any client over the internet, the admin endpoint access is restricted through our IP allow list. So let's just go ahead and cancel this and head over to Capella and set up my allow list. And I'm going to go ahead and add my IP address to the IP allow list. Can I add my IP address? Okay, so I've added my IP address. Let's try this again. Go back, and I'm going to try and retrieve. Well, it's unauthorized. That's because all accesses to the admin endpoint have to be authenticated. Go back to the app endpoint, the connection string. Notice that there is an option for setting up the credentials. These are the credentials that are needed for user administration and metrics access. So let's go to the manage credentials and set up. So let's get back here, go to my authorization tab. Okay, and let's try this again. Okay, so notice that I've retrieved the user. I give this is the username. And these are the channels associated with the user. The bang refers to the public system channel. And this was a channel, well, we did not statically assign this channel, but if you remember, I mentioned that in the access control function, channels can be dynamically assigned. And so this channel assignment was done by the system when it processed the document as part of the access control function. So let's go ahead and create a new user, okay? So let's go back here again, set up my authentication credentials, and let's go to the body of the document, and I'm going to give it some name. Let's say foo. I'm going to give it some role, a channel. It doesn't matter. Channels again are created when a document is assigned to the channel. I'm going to just give it a name, channel.foo, and let's go ahead and create this user. Looks like it's created successfully, and we can confirm that by heading over to the App Users tab, and you see that the user has been created. Yeah, that's how you do user administration through the admin endpoint. So for the final part of this walkthrough, let's head back to the Connect tab and notice that we have the metrics connection, the same credentials and the IP allow list that applies to the admin access endpoint applies to the metrics endpoint as well. So let's go ahead and copy this. You know the drill by now. Go to our Postman client. I'm going to update the environment variable for a metrics URL. And let's go. Once again, this URL definition is available as part of our reference guide. So you go here to our metrics, and this is the endpoint. So go back to my client and just, well, set up the admin credentials. There you go. Okay, so now let's go back to slides and conclude this walkthrough. So once your applications are connected and up and running, we offer a number of options when it comes to monitoring your app endpoints. When it comes to scaling, you need to have a paid cluster. Then you can, of course, update the configuration of the app endpoint and also decommission your app endpoint. Quickly go back to our Capella UI and to the tabs here. You can see you can monitor this. We had that connection, the single replication that was going on, a couple of documents that we read was written. So you can use that. And remember, we also had a couple of authentication failures. So this dashboard is pretty comprehensive in terms of giving you insights into what's happening. But once again, if on a production environment, you're probably going to want to bring in your own monitoring framework. You can change the configuration at any point. So there you have it. If you have any questions, comments, feedback, you can reach out to us through one of the many channels listed in the resources section below. And thank you for listening, and happy coding.